The failure began at 14:37 Pacific Time on a Tuesday afternoon in March, when a routine firmware update pushed to the centralized building automation system managing emergency egress lighting across 847 commercial and transit facilities in Los Angeles County triggered a synchronization conflict in the addressable lighting controller network. The update, version 4.7.2 of the SafetyNet Egress Management Platform, contained a revised heartbeat protocol intended to reduce network polling overhead by implementing a staggered ping architecture across controller nodes. Within 18 minutes of deployment, the new handshake sequence created a cascading desynchronization event as individual LED driver modules began reporting conflicting time-based references to their parent controllers. The system architecture relied on a master clock signal distributed via Ethernet backhaul to ensure that battery backup circuits, photocell sensors, and strobe duty cycle timers operated in coordinated phases across multiple buildings. When the updated firmware altered the expected response window from 200 milliseconds to 350 milliseconds without corresponding changes to the timeout thresholds in legacy controller firmware still running in 63% of the installed base, a pattern emerged in which newer nodes interpreted silence as a command to enter autonomous emergency mode, while older nodes continued to await instructions that would never arrive in the expected format. Building automation logs from the first affected site, a 14-story office complex in Century City, show that exit sign controller boards began cycling through their pre-programmed fault states in rapid succession: green steady state, green slow blink, green rapid blink, off, diagnostic strobe, and back to steady state, completing the entire sequence in periods ranging from 4 to 11 seconds depending on the firmware revision of each individual sign. The effect was not uniform. Signs manufactured before 2019 entered a holding pattern of 4 Hz strobing, while units installed after the 2021 code update oscillated between full brightness and complete darkness at intervals determined by their internal battery charge state. No alarm condition registered at the central monitoring station because each controller reported its status as operational even as it executed behaviors far outside normal parameters. The first human observation of abnormal function came from a facilities manager who noted unusual flickering in a third-floor corridor but attributed it to a ballast failure rather than a systemic control error. By 1500, the propagation of the firmware conflict had reached 412 buildings across the metropolitan area, following the update deployment schedule that prioritized high-occupancy commercial structures and transit stations. The affected infrastructure included office towers in downtown Los Angeles, shopping centers in Santa Monica and Glendale, parking structures serving LAX terminals, and 17 stations along the Metro Red and Purple lines. In windowless interior spaces, the rapid cycling of exit signage created optical conditions that fell outside the established photometric standards for emergency egress lighting. The International Building Code specifies a minimum illumination of 1 foot candle at floor level along egress paths, measured as a sustained average, with the understanding that human eyes require consistent light levels to maintain spatial orientation and depth perception. The malfunctioning signs produced illumination patterns that varied from 0 to 18-foot candles within periods of less than 1 second, creating an effective strobe rate that fell within the range known to induce disorientation and visual fatigue even in individuals without photosensitive conditions. LED exit signs in the affected buildings used high-efficiency chips rated at 2.1 watts with a luminous efficacy of 127 lumens per watt, producing approximately 267 lumens per sign in normal operation. When the control fault triggered rapid on-off cycling, the instantaneous contrast between full output and complete darkness in spaces with no alternative light sources exceeded the adaptive capacity of human vision. Controller logs indicate that some units entered a diagnostic mode in which they cycled through their full RGB color range, causing exit signs to flash red, blue, yellow, and white in addition to the standard green, further degrading the semantic clarity of the signage. In parking structures beneath Bunker Hill and along Hope Street, where natural light penetration is 0 and architectural lighting systems are motion-activated to conserve energy, the exit signs represented the only continuous light source. When these began strobing at rates between 3 and 7 Hz, the structures became effectively unnavigable for periods lasting several minutes at a time. The technical character of the failure was such that it did not trigger the building emergency response protocols designed to address power outages, fire alarm activations, or seismic events. Battery backup systems for emergency lighting are designed to activate when mains power is interrupted, providing a minimum of 90 minutes of illumination to facilitate evacuation. In this event, mains power remains stable at all affected sites. The battery circuits did engage, but not in response to a loss of primary power. Instead, the confused controller logic interpreted the rapid state changes as repeated fault conditions requiring backup activation. Batteries rated for a single deep discharge cycle per month began cycling on and off multiple times per minute. Thermal sensors embedded in battery compartments at a metro station in Koreatown recorded temperature increases from 21 degrees Celsius to 38 degrees Celsius within 40 minutes, as lithium iron phosphate cells switched between charge and discharge states far beyond their design parameters. The battery management systems, designed to prevent thermal runaway, began disconnecting cells that exceeded temperature thresholds, which in turn caused additional fault signals to propagate back through the controller network. Some exit signs, having exhausted their battery capacity through rapid cycling, went dark entirely and remained so even though building power was uninterrupted. Fire code requires that exit signs remain illuminated at all times when a building is occupied, with backup power sufficient to maintain visibility during evacuation. The malfunctioning system created a paradox in which signs were simultaneously receiving power and reporting battery depletion, leading to intermittent blackouts and egress marking that would have been interpreted by code enforcement officials as a critical life safety violation had they been observed during an inspection. Automated monitoring systems at the central office continued to receive OK status packets from the affected buildings because the fault condition existed within the operational logic of the controllers themselves, rather than in the power distribution infrastructure. Between 1530 and 1700, the spatial consequences of the lighting fault became evident in facilities with high interior complexity and limited natural illumination. Modern commercial architecture in Los Angeles frequently employs deep floor plates with central core layouts, placing elevator banks, stairwells, and restrooms in windowless interior zones, surrounded by perimeter office space. Exit signage and emergency path marking in these areas serve as the primary wayfinding system during both normal operations and emergency conditions. When the signs began exhibiting unpredictable behavior, occupants in interior corridors experienced a form of navigational disruption that had not been anticipated in egress design standards. A person walking through a corridor relies on exit signs not only for directional information, but also as stable visual reference points that establish spatial continuity. The human visual system uses such fixed landmarks to construct an internal map of navigational space. When these landmarks began to appear and disappear at irregular intervals, or to strobe at frequencies that made them painful to look at directly, the cognitive process of wayfinding was disrupted. Occupants stopped walking and remained stationary in corridors, waiting for the lighting to stabilize. In several buildings, people used mobile phone flashlights to navigate spaces that, under normal conditions, were adequately lit. The fundamental function of an exit sign is to remain visible and semantically clear. These signs were highly visible but semantically chaotic, conveying no reliable information about egress direction. Photocell data from ambient light sensors installed in a 17-story office building in Century City shows that hallway illumination levels fluctuated between 0.3 and 14.2 foot candles over a 20-minute period, with the variance entirely attributable to the exit sign malfunction rather than changes in daylighting or overhead fixtures. The strobe effect was most pronounced in spaces where multiple exit signs were visible simultaneously, as the signs were not cycling in phase with one another, creating overlapping pulses of light that prevented the eye from adapting to any stable luminance level. In underground transit environments, the impact of the fault was magnified by the absence of alternative orientation cues. Metro stations along the Red Line between Union Station and North Hollywood are enclosed spaces with platform levels located between 12 and 30 meters below grade. Emergency lighting in these facilities consists of overhead fluorescent fixtures on battery backup and LED exit signs marking stairs, escalators, and platform exits. When the controller fault propagated to these systems, the exit signs at Pershing Square, Civic Center, and Westlake MacArthur Park stations began cycling through fault states. Platform surveillance recordings show exit signs above stairway entrances alternating between darkness and full illumination at intervals of approximately 6 seconds, while signs at escalator landings displayed a rapid green-red-green blink pattern inconsistent with any standard emergency signal. The visual environment on the platform became unstable. Passengers waiting for trains used the exit signs as reference points to orient themselves relative to stairway access, but when the signs became unreliable, spatial orientation was compromised. The platforms are linear spaces with limited cross-sectional complexity, but during peak commuting hours they accommodate several hundred people at a time. The malfunctioning signage did not cause panic, but it did induce hesitation. Video footage shows clusters of passengers standing near but not proceeding towards stairs, apparently uncertain whether the exit route was operational. The confusion was compounded by the fact that platform lighting and train operations remained normal, creating a cognitive dissonance in which the environment appeared functional except for the erratic behavior of the emergency egress markers. Station agents received multiple inquiries about whether an evacuation was in progress, but because no alarm had been triggered and no emergency condition existed outside the signage fault, they had no formal guidance to offer. The addressable controller system for metro stations operates on a separate network segment from the commercial building controllers, but it received the same firmware update and exhibited the same synchronization failure, confirming that the root cause was the protocol mismatch rather than any site-specific wiring or configuration error. At 17:15, building operations staff at multiple sites began attempting manual overrides of the malfunctioning exit signs. Standard procedure for resetting addressable emergency lighting involves accessing the controller interface through a building automation workstation and issuing a reset command to individual zones or to the entire network. Technicians at a high-rise office building in downtown discovered that the controller interface was unresponsive, displaying a synchronizing status message that persisted for more than 20 minutes without completing. Other sites reported similar interface lockouts, indicating that the firmware update had not only caused the operational fault, but it also disabled the manual control pathways intended for fault recovery. In buildings where controllers could still be accessed, reset commands produced temporary corrections that lasted between 90 seconds and 4 minutes before the signs reverted to erratic behavior. The reset process itself became part of the problem. Each reset triggered a battery test sequence that further depleted the backup cells and increased thermal stress on the power management circuits. Facilities managers in 17 buildings independently decided to de-energize the emergency lighting circuits entirely by opening breakers at electrical panels, reasoning that dark exit signs were preferable to strobing ones. This action violated fire code and building occupancy permits, but it was judged locally as the least harmful option under the circumstances. In buildings where this was done, temporary battery-powered exit signs were placed in corridors, purchased from hardware suppliers and installed without integration into the building automation system. These devices provided stable illumination but were not connected to fire alarm circuits and would not activate automatically in an emergency, representing a downgrade in life safety protection. The decision to disconnect automated emergency lighting was not coordinated across sites. It was an emergent response pattern based on individual assessments of immediate conditions. No formal guidance was available from the fire marshal's office or the building safety authority because the situation had not been identified as a jurisdiction-wide event at that point in the timeline. Technical investigation into the firmware fault began at 1800 when the vendor support team for the SafetyNet egress management platform was contacted by multiple building automation contractors reporting identical symptoms across unrelated sites. Initial diagnostic logs indicated that the heartbeat protocol revision in firmware 4.7.2 had altered the expected timing structure of the network polling cycle without corresponding updates to the controller's state machine logic. The system was designed such that each controller would report its status to the central server at intervals of 15 seconds, wait for an acknowledgement, and then proceed with normal operation. The updated firmware changed the acknowledgement timeout from 200 milliseconds to 350 milliseconds to accommodate network latency in larger installations, but the state machine code still treated any response delay beyond 200 milliseconds as a communication failure. This caused controllers to assume they had lost contact with the central server and to enter autonomous emergency mode, which activated battery backup circuits and switched to a pre-programmed emergency lighting pattern. The emergency pattern itself was intended for use during fire alarm activation and included a slow blink to draw attention to exit routes. However, because the controllers were cycling in and out of emergency mode multiple times per minute, the blink pattern became a rapid strobe. Further complication arose from the fact that controllers manufactured by different suppliers within the safety net ecosystem implemented the emergency blink pattern with different frequencies, some at 2 Hz, some at 4, and others at 7. When multiple controllers were present in the same visual field, the combined effect was a chaotic flicker with no discernible pattern. The vendor issued a rollback command at 1830, instructing all systems to revert to firmware version 4.6.8, but the rollback process required each controller to complete its current battery test cycle before accepting new firmware, and many controllers were locked in continuous test cycles due to the fault condition. Estimated time for full rollback completion was given as 4 to 6 hours, meaning that affected buildings would remain in a degraded state well into the evening. During the rollback period from 1830 to 2300, buildings remained occupied but operated under informal modified egress protocols. In office towers, building management sent email notifications advising occupants to use stairwells for vertical circulation rather than elevators, not because elevator operation was impaired, but because the exit signage in elevator lobbies was unreliable and might not provide clear direction in the event of an actual emergency. Several companies with leased floors in affected buildings elected to release employees early, reducing occupancy to maintenance and security staff. Retail centers and transit stations, which operate on different schedules, maintained normal operations but stationed additional personnel near stairway and exit locations to provide verbal direction in the absence of reliable signage. The response was uneven across the city because there was no centralized incident command and no formal declaration of an emergency condition. Some building operators treated the fault as a minor inconvenience, while others implemented partial evacuations. The lack of a coordinated response reflected the ambiguity of the failure mode. The building systems were operational, the power was on, and no fire or structural hazard existed, yet the fundamental navigational logic of the interior environment had been compromised. Fire safety inspections conducted in the following weeks would classify the event as a failure of emergency egress illumination during non-emergency conditions, a category that occupies a gray area in code enforcement. The buildings were not unsafe in the sense of structural failure or active hazard, but they were operating outside the parameters that define code-compliant occupancy. The decision to allow continued use during the rollback period was made locally by building operators without consultation with fire authorities, reflecting a general uncertainty about whether the fault constituted an occupiable condition or a reason for evacuation. Firmware rollback completion was confirmed at 2340, with 831 of the original 847 affected sites successfully reverting to version 4.6.8 and resuming normal exit sign operation. The remaining 16 sites experienced rollback failures attributed to corrupted flash memory in controller boards that had undergone excessive thermal cycling during the fault period. These controllers required manual replacement of circuit boards, a process that extended over the following 72 hours. Post-incident analysis conducted by independent fire protection engineers reviewed building automation logs, battery discharge records, and photocell sensor data to reconstruct the sequence and spatial extent of the failure. The analysis confirmed that the fault was entirely attributable to the software handshake error and that no hardware defect or physical infrastructure failure contributed to the event. Strobe frequencies recorded during the fault period ranged from 2.8 to 7.3 Hz, with peak luminance contrast ratios exceeding 50:1 in windowless corridors, both values sufficient to cause visual discomfort and disorientation. Battery cells and 1,247 exit signs were found to have exceeded their rated cycle count and were flagged for replacement. Thermal excursions recorded in battery compartments reached levels that, while below the threshold for thermal runaway, were sufficient to reduce long-term cell capacity by an estimated 15 to 20%. The analysis noted that existing code provisions for emergency lighting assume that battery backup circuits activate once per event and remain in a steady discharge state until power is restored or evacuation is complete. The event exposed a gap in code assumptions. There is no standard that addresses the failure mode in which backup circuits cycle rapidly between active and inactive states while mains power remains available. The technical review recommended that future firmware updates include rollback testing in isolated network segments before deployment to production systems, and that controller state machines be revised to include hysteresis in fault detection logic to prevent rapid state cycling. Formal documentation of the incident was filed with the Los Angeles Department of Building and Safety and the California State Fire Marshal's Office in the form of incident reports from affected building operators and a technical summary from the safety net vendor. The reports classified the event as a temporary degradation of emergency egress lighting function due to control system software error, and noted that no injuries occurred and no evacuation was required. The fire marshal's review focused on the question of whether occupied buildings with malfunctioning exit signs should have been evacuated as a precautionary measure, but concluded that the decision to maintain occupancy was within the discretion of building operators given that no active emergency condition existed. The review did note that the incident revealed limitations in current monitoring and notification protocols, which are designed to detect power failures and alarm activations but do not effectively identify control logic faults that leave systems energized but non-functional. Recommendations included the development of real-time photometric monitoring for exit signs, which would measure actual light output rather than relying solely on controller status reports, and the establishment of inter-building communication networks that could identify widespread faults more rapidly than the current site-by-site reporting model. The National Fire Protection Association was notified of the event as part of ongoing revisions to NFPA 101, the Life Safety Code, which establishes minimum requirements for egress illumination and marking. The technical committee reviewing emergency lighting standards added the incident to its case study database for consideration in future code cycles. The event did not result in regulatory changes or enforcement actions, but it was noted in internal reliability assessments as an example of how interdependencies in networked building systems can produce failure modes that are not addressed by component-level testing or installation inspections. The incident was classified as resolved upon completion of hardware replacements and confirmation that all sites had returned to baseline operational parameters, with final closure documented in building automation system maintenance logs dated 11 days after the initial firmware deployment.